Even though it happened years ago, many of us here this morning can still recall the tragedy as if it were yesterday. Remember the way the whole country held its breath, prayed its prayers, and sat glued to the television set? We watched, spellbound, as Herculean efforts of hundreds of firefighters, engineers, mining experts, and emergency service specialists labored to save the life of one trapped child. And as we watched and prayed, this little girl became everyone's child. This child was baby Jessica, as the media dubbed her, a 2-year-old who had somehow managed to fall down an abandoned well pipe with an unbelievably narrow diameter, which made sending anyone or any equipment after her impossible. The little girl's body was wedge tight, bent in two at the waist, dozens of feet below ground. And after all conventional rescue techniques failed, the small Texas community turned all of its brawn and willpower loose. They determined that they must dig a new intersecting rescue tunnel in order to free the trapped child. And it took agonizing days of digging and shoring up crumbling tunnel walls, scooping out earth, if you remember, inch by inch, for fear of shifting the soil that was still holding baby Jessica's pipeline prison intact. But the rescuers finally reached the little girl, and under the blaze of 1,000,000 megawatts of anxious media cameras, the little girl, now the entire nation's lost child, was finally pulled free of her concrete straitjacket that had held her captive. She was rushed to her waiting parents and physicians, and beyond all hope, she was alive, intact, and except for a broken leg and some nasty head scrapes, relatively unharmed. So despite the size and diversity of our country, the drama of baby Jessica's lostness and foundness touched hearts nationwide. Every parent, I think, hugged their child just a little bit tighter. And every brother and sister looked at each other in a new, fragile light. For just one moment in time, one lost little girl became lost to each of us. And when everyone's child, baby Jessica, was found at last, an entire nation rejoiced. In today's gospel text, Jesus reminds his audience, especially those surly, grumbling Pharisees and scribes, that this is the kind of rejoicing that goes on in heaven every time a sinner repents. Jesus describes God as a rescue worker, out prowling the hillsides, searching under the bed, looking anywhere and everywhere in order to find the lost causes and last cases that have fallen away. The gospel text for this fourth Sunday in Lent, it's a familiar story. Sometimes we call it the story of the prodigal son, other times the story of the loving father. But it is this amazing story of wanting and searching for what seems lost but is always within reach if we just know how to look. You see, it was the madness of wanting, of fear, of uncertainty, of not knowing that drove the younger son to make his request. And given his share of the inheritance, which really was not at all an uncommon thing in his day, the younger son ran away as fast as his feet would take him. And he ran to satisfy the wanting, to try to mitigate the uncertainty. He tried everything that his fevered brain could think of. But nothing slowed down the wanting. And he watched his fortunes fade as he plodded along. The hunger just as strong as ever, the wanting unabated, unsatisfied, still driving him on, until knee-deep in pig slop, we read, he came to his senses, or some translations say he came to himself. And the wanting changed. His inability to trust the future now transformed into a desperation that exposed his foolishness in trusting only himself and his wants. He came to himself and he discovered what he had already had not been able to appreciate, and had thrown away. He also knew the loving character of his father, and so he took a risk, decided that even a taste of what he had had before was better than his current circumstances. So he made the long journey back, leaving his madness behind. And then a really unexpected thing happened. His father ran to meet him, gathered him up, and treated him as a beloved son who had never left, as though he belonged. And so he was swept up into the party, welcomed home where he had all that he ever wanted, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, not quite. The brother, the one left behind, he had chewed on his frustration with his younger brother every day when he marched out to the field to work. And his satisfaction in his work and his home and his family just evaporated like drops of sweat on the hard-packed dirt he struggled to turn over. So when he stumbled back on that day and heard the news about his brother's return, I can just see his face become even harder, bitter, like he'd just taken a bite of a sour apple. And his father found him like that, spitting resentment, and begged him to come in and celebrate. But he refused, and he said, "Look how many years I have stayed here serving you, never giving you one moment of grief." Anyone really believe that? "But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then this son of yours who has thrown away your money on loose living shows up and you go all out with a feast." Let's think about that for a moment. Let's look at verse 12. He divided his property among them. The older brother got his share too. Every day, it was his. Everything was his, probably even double his brother's share because he was the oldest son. But he never saw it. He never claimed it. His father said, "Hey, son, you're living the party." But his bitterness, his resentment kept him from claiming it, from living it. All he had was his own wanting. And what we'll never know, because Jesus doesn't tells us, is whether or not the older brother ever came to his senses, ever came to himself. So this parable invites us to sit with the younger son in the messes of our own making, with the elder son in his bitterness and his fear of being overlooked, and with the father as he leaves the comfort of his home to bring in all that is lost and all that feels forsaken. And part of the reason that this story is so compelling and so beloved is because we are never only one of the characters. I mean, who among us has not squandered the love we've been given? Or who among us has not felt the bitter sting of insecurity and fear at being left out? And who among us has not at some time chased after love, hoping that it will be returned? Can't we all recognize ourselves in the deep hope and hunger that someone, God in particular, will leave the threshold to come and find us when we're lost? Or will invite us to the party in the midst of our fear of being left out? Why do we all too often settle for the less than satisfying state of resentment and bitterness? According to Merriam-Webster, resentment is a feeling of indignant displeasure or persistent ill will at something regarded as a wrong, insult, or injury, with plenty of definitions to make the definition all too clear. Bitterness, indignation, irritation, pique, displeasure, dissatisfaction, disgruntlement, discontentment, discontent, hard feelings, acrimony, rancor, animosity, and hostility. Anyone ever feel any of those? There is plenty of resentment to go around in this story of the prodigal son. And when that resentment is connected to our belief in an injustice toward our own being, friends, it is really difficult for us to give up our entitlement to that resentment. So we might see ourselves in the shoes of the older brother, resenting the younger brother for not following the protocol of birth order, birthright, and responsibility, resenting his father for welcoming a son undeserving of such love. Or we might see ourselves in the shoes of the younger brother, resentful for having to wait for what is owed him, resentful for having to play the game to get back into his father's graces. Or we might see ourselves in the shoes of the father, having to show mercy when mercy is not deserved. But when we start to realize that God's lavish love is actually the object of our resentment, that's when the gap can become almost unbearable. What do we do when we admit that we actually resent God for God's seeming unfairness, God's welcome of those unworthy of mercy in our eyes, God's indiscriminate grace? Now, there is a source of resentment that's hard to admit in the first place and not as easy to let go. So the steps for doing that are far less clear. Because it seems that God's answer to our resentment is to give us opportunities for it. God doesn't take it away. God doesn't protect us for it. Rather, God exposes it, names it. Sometimes it even seems like God eggs it on. So maybe resentment can help to remind us that we are not God, and that God does not operate within our systems of fairness or within our theories of theology. Resentment, you see, it forces us to take a very good and long look at ourselves and ask, why are we resentful? What's the rub? What might we be missing in our lives that causes so much resentment? Now, one really good way that experts tell us to deal with resentment is to remember how to laugh and not take ourselves so seriously. So I ran across some humorous answers given by some music students in an unidentified junior high school in Houston, Texas. And when you hear these answers, you will understand why that junior high school is to this day unidentified. For example, these students wrote, music is sung by two people at the same time is called a duel. A xylophone is a musical instrument used mainly to illustrate the letter X. Dirges are songs to be sung at sad occasions like funerals, weddings, and the like. Refrain means don't do it. A virtuoso is a musician with real high morals. J.S. Bach died from 1750 to the present day. Handel was half German, half Italian, and half English. He was rather large. My favorite. A quartet is when 4 people sing at the same time. A quintet is when 5 people sing, and a sextet, I know what it is, but I'd rather not say. And it is wonderful, isn't it, to laugh with children at the delightful things that they sometimes say. And it's fun to laugh at the comical antics of clowns or the hilarious wit of comedians. But truly, the best humor of all is when we laugh at ourselves. And that's a mark of maturity. It eases our self-pity, it diminishes our resentments, and it saves us from taking ourselves too seriously. Ethel Barrymore said it well. You grow up when you get your first good laugh at yourself. So when you feel resentful, which is often a byproduct of feeling rejected in one way or another, remember that that feeling really is only temporary, and go talk it out with somebody. Remember that the one that's rejecting you is really the one with the problem, and remember to laugh and use your sense of humor. And although it is inevitable that the hurt still remains despite the laughter, remember that God accepts you no matter what. God is with you. And that, of course, is the key message of the Gospels. It's the real good news for those who find themselves feeling resentful or rejected. It's the point of the parable, isn't it? The gracious, accepting, caring love of God. William Barclay put it like this. So then, for me, the supreme truth of Christianity is that in Jesus, I see God. And when I see Jesus feeding the hungry, comforting the sorrowing, befriending the rejected, I can say, this is what God is like. All through his life, God was saying to us through Jesus, I loved you like that. When Jesus healed the sick and touched the untouchable and loved the unlovable, he was saying, I love you like that. And when he endured the insults, the injuries, the disloyalties, and the cross, he was saying, there is nothing in the world that you can do that will ever stop me from loving you. Yes, we might find ourselves lost from time to time, resentful, rejected, floundering. But every life we encounter teaches us something, offers us something. If only a chance to love more, to care more, to give more, to forgive more. And the abiding hope that the lost can be found, sometimes that they can even find themselves, is a powerful reminder that God never stops looking for us. So we're asked again today to take another step forward. Maybe it's your first step toward being found, because God is waiting. Amen.